Hi everyone. Welcome back. We're glad to have you with us today. Let's start. I never imagined my world could unravel so completely over the course of one night. But here we are. It all started with a seemingly innocent barbecue, a gathering of old friends and familiar faces. A night meant for laughter and connection turned into a nightmare that still burns in my memory. But let me take you back to the beginning, where it all started to go wrong. I grew up in a quaint coastal town where everyone knew your name, your family, and probably what you had for breakfast. My father, James Taylor, was a pillar of the community, running a successful insurance business that stood as a symbol of trust and reliability. Growing up in his shadow wasn't always easy, but it instilled in me a sense of responsibility and a deep respect for hard work. By the time I graduated with a finance degree, I was determined to carve out my own niche. My plan? Help people grow their wealth steadily and responsibly. None of that high-risk, high-reward nonsense. I opened a modest practice in town, sharing office space with my father. The locals trusted me, partly because of my dad's reputation and partly because I was earnest about building relationships with my clients. Things were going well, but I realized quickly that our little town didn't have the population to fuel my ambitions. I started splitting my time between here and the city, chasing bigger opportunities. My wife, Emily, wasn't thrilled about this arrangement, but she understood my drive. Or so I thought. Emily was everything I wasn't: outgoing, vivacious, and magnetic. People were naturally drawn to her, and she thrived in social settings. She loved organizing gatherings, which is how we ended up hosting these monthly barbecues. Our close-knit group included our neighbors, Lisa and Mike, and Emily's high school best friend, Sarah, along with her husband, Tom. They were the core crew, though others occasionally joined in. The night of the barbecue was perfect: clear skies and a warm breeze. Emily had her usual sparkle, bustling around and making sure everything was just right. "What's the theme tonight?" I asked as I prepped the grill. "Let's play a fun game," she said with her signature enthusiasm. "Something lighthearted that everyone will enjoy." "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. You just focus on the barbecue." I didn't mind. I liked the simplicity of grilling, the rhythmic clink of utensils against metal, the steady hiss of flames licking the food. It was grounding. The guests began arriving, laughter and chatter filling the air as bottles of wine and trays of food were passed around. Tom, a towering guy with a booming laugh, brought his signature craft beer. Sarah, his wife, had baked one of her famous pies. Mike, our next-door neighbor, cracked jokes with his usual dry humor, while Lisa kept him in line with a playful roll of her eyes. But Emily was electric that night, captivating the room as always. Her light brown curls caught the glow of the string lights as she flitted from one guest to another, laughing, teasing, and charming. I should have been proud. Instead, a strange unease stirred in my chest. It wasn't until later, when most of the group had migrated to the hot tub, that the pieces started falling into place. I wasn't much for the hot tub scene, so I stayed back to clean up the remnants of dinner. As I worked, their laughter echoed from the deck, louder and more carefree than usual. Something about it felt off. When I finally joined them, Emily was sitting a little too close to Tom. Their laughter seemed different, intimate in a way I couldn't ignore. My stomach churned, but I forced a smile, blaming the creeping doubt on my imagination, or maybe the extra glass of wine I'd had earlier. But that night, as I lay awake beside Emily, her carefree laughter replayed in my mind like a broken record. Something was wrong, and for the first time in my life, I felt a dark, gnawing sense of certainty. I needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. The night was settling into a relaxed rhythm, the kind of atmosphere where laughter is easy and the drinks flow just fast enough to blur the edges of the world. We had finished dinner on the back deck, the air thick with the scent of grilled food and the faint saltiness from the nearby ocean. By this point, most of us were a couple of drinks in, and the mood was light, even playful. Tom, the diesel mechanic with ambitions of becoming shop manager, had cornered me earlier for advice. "Do you think joining the owner's church would help my chances?" he asked, his brow furrowed in thought. I mulled it over before responding. "Only if you're sincere. People can sense when something's disingenuous, and it might do more harm than good." He nodded, though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. We were mid-conversation when Sarah, his wife, chimed in from across the table. "So, Emily, what's the plan for tonight?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying that playful lilt that always seemed to accompany a glass of wine. Emily, my wife, set down her drink and smiled. Okay, everyone keep an open mind and remember, it's just for fun. We're playing truth or dare. A mix of groans and cheers erupted around the table. I felt a twinge of discomfort, but the others seemed thrilled. Tom, Sarah, and Mike clapped and hooped their approval. Lisa, sitting next to Mike, offered a faint smile, but didn't seem particularly enthused. I glanced at Emily, who was positively glowing under the string lights. She shot me a quick smile before turning her attention back to the group. That smile, it was the same one she'd given me the night we met at Lucas, a trendy bar in the city. I'd been immediately drawn to her, the way her light brown curls framed her face, and how her laughter seemed to light up the room. She was out of my league, or so I thought, but somehow, she'd chosen me. As the game began, the question started off innocently enough, with just a touch of mischief. Who's your celebrity crush? How old were you when you had your first kiss? But it didn't take long for the dares to escalate. Then came Mike's turn. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Emily, he said, his voice dripping with challenge. Truth or dare? Emily, ever the life of the party, didn't hesitate. Got it. The group erupted in a mix of cheers and anticipatory laughter. Mike didn't miss a beat. I dare you to take off either your top or your shorts. The table fell silent for a beat, and I felt my stomach tighten. Wait a minute, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Emily brushed off my concern with a wave of her hand. It's fine, JT, she said, her tone light. It's like wearing a swimsuit. No big deal. Before I could say more, she stood up, slipping off her shorts to reveal a pair of form-fitting underwear that might as well have been part of her swimwear collection. The group cheered, Tom and Mike the loudest, while Lisa raised her eyebrows but said nothing. I forced a smile, but inside, I was seething. Emily had always enjoyed being the center of attention, and while I'd admired her confidence, moments like this pushed the limits of my patience. I couldn't shake the feeling that her behavior tonight wasn't just playful. It was provocative. As the game continued, I sat back, sipping my wine and watching the group. The laughter was loud, the energy high, but I felt a growing sense of unease. My eyes kept drifting to Emily and Mike, their easy camaraderie, the way their gazes lingered just a second too long. The game quickly spiraled out of control. When Emily stood to take her turn, she whipped off her top without hesitation, revealing a lacy white bra. She stood there confidently, basking in the whistles from Tom and Mike. Sarah giggled. You go, girl. Emily was clearly loving the attention. I, on the other hand, was seething beneath a forced smile. This wasn't playful anymore. It was crossing a line. But I kept my thoughts to myself, unwilling to make a scene. The game continued, each turn edging closer to outright chaos. When Sarah was dared to flash the group, her husband, Tom, encouraged her with an easy grin. Go for it, he said. Sarah laughed, stood up, and did it. Everyone roared with laughter, except Lisa and me. I caught Lisa's eye. Her thin smile mirrored my discomfort. One more round, then we're done, I announced, trying to regain some control. There were some laughs and a few groans of protest, but the group agreed. It was Emily's turn to issue a dare. She turned to Mike, who was already smirking, clearly expecting something outrageous. Okay, dare, Mike challenged. Emily grinned mischievously. Flash your Johnny for 10 seconds. Lisa's face darkened immediately. Don't you dare, she snapped, her tone sharp. But Mike was already standing. With a theatrical flourish, he unbuttoned his shorts, dropped them, boxers and all, and stood there shamelessly. Sarah and Emily burst into laughter, their gazes fixed on him, while Tom howled with delight. To my shock, Mike even gyrated his hips like a male dancer. Lisa shot up from her chair, her expression icy. I'm leaving, she announced, her voice tight with anger. Trent, you can either get in the car now, fully clothed, or find your own way home. The party quickly unraveled after that. People made their excuses and left, and soon it was just Emily and me, cleaning up the deck in strained silence. That got out of hand, I said, finally, breaking the tension. Emily shrugged, brushing it off. It was just fun. Don't be such a stick in the mud. Emily, people were practically naked here. You were practically naked, I said, unable to keep the irritation out of my voice. She smirked. Naked? I'll show you naked. Before I could respond, she stripped completely standing there in front of me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Despite my frustration, I couldn't help but be distracted. And for a moment, I let it go. But the next morning, as I went for my usual run, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The way Emily had looked at Mike, the ease with which she dismissed my concerns, it gnawed at me. During the solitude of my jog, I resolved to have a serious conversation with her. When I returned, I heard Emily on the phone. She must have noticed me coming in because her tone changed, and she dropped her voice. Just before she hung up, I thought I heard her say the word package. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, just Sarah," Emily said, laughing lightly. She and Tom thought the party was a blast. They said it was the best one yet. About that, I began, keeping my tone calm. "I think we need to talk about what happened last night. Specifically, your behavior." Emily bristled immediately. "What about it?" "It was innocent fun. No one else is upset, just you," she snapped. I tried to explain how I felt, but she wasn't interested. After venting her frustration, she gave me the silent treatment and retreated to the other room. I spent the rest of the morning doing yard work, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Was I overreacting? I didn't think so. Emily was vibrant and free-spirited. That's part of what drew me to her. But there were boundaries, weren't there? She was my wife, and there were certain things that were meant for us alone. I couldn't shake the nagging insecurity. Emily was beautiful, magnetic, and constantly drawing attention. I wasn't unattractive. I kept in good shape, but I was plain compared to her. Worse, I knew the attention she got wasn't always harmless. Later that week, we were invited to another party, this time hosted by an acquaintance in the city. Emily dressed to the nines, slipping into a tight red dress that barely covered her chest. My eyes nearly popped out of my head. "You like my dress?" she teased, striking a playful pose. "Emily, you look amazing, but..." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "It's a little skimpy, don't you think? I might have clients there, and it's, well, a lot." Her playful expression vanished, replaced by a flash of anger. "So what, JT? I'm not allowed to look good?" "That's not what I'm saying," I replied quickly. But she was already mad, and when Emily got mad, it always escalated. The tension followed us to the party, and I couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of a bigger problem? Emily was still fuming when we arrived at the party, and things between us were frosty at best. She'd worn the red dress that had caused the argument earlier, and while I couldn't deny she looked stunning, I couldn't shake my unease. The house was impressive, a sprawling estate perched in the hills, with elegant decor and an endless spread of food and drinks. It was the kind of place where connections were made, and I was eager to make a good impression with my colleagues and acquaintances. As the evening went on, Emily drew plenty of attention, mostly from the men, and most of that attention was centered squarely on her cleavage. She stayed by my side at first, which earned me a sudden wave of popularity from colleagues who seemed eager to get to know the man married to the most stunning woman in the room. At one point, I stepped away to grab drinks for us. When I returned, she was chatting with someone I hadn't seen in years, Jim Callister, a guy from my college days. Jim was the type of guy who always seemed to have everything: good looks, confidence, and that infuriatingly smug smile. He cruised through life with a cocky ease, and tonight was no different. He had a glass of champagne in one hand and a self-assured air that grated on my nerves. When he saw me, he acted like we were old friends. "JT," he said, grinning as if he'd been waiting all night to catch up. Emily was eating it up, laughing at his jokes, and hanging on his every word. I managed to steer her away, but as parties go, we eventually drifted apart again. I found myself deep in conversation with some work colleagues about business strategies, and when I glanced at the clock, I realized it had been over an hour since I'd last seen her. A pang of unease hit me, and I casually began to search for her. First, I checked the living room, then the kitchen, then the family room off the kitchen. Nothing. I didn't want to appear panicked, but I felt a growing sense of urgency. Jim was nowhere to be found either. I stepped outside into the brisk winter air, where a group of people stood smoking near the edge of the patio. Still no sign of her. Just as I was about to head back inside, I heard her laugh, distinct and unmistakable. It was coming from down the street. I walked down the sidewalk, and there she was strolling with Jim. They were laughing, their voices low but intimate. It took her a moment to notice me. "Oh, hi, honey," she said a little too brightly. Jim was just showing me his new BMW. "She's a handful," Jim added with a smirk. "I mean the car." He laughed at his own joke. I looked at Emily. Nothing seemed overtly wrong, but her hair was slightly tousled, and her expression had a strange edge to it. I forced a tight smile. "I'm leaving now," I said evenly. "Just wanted to see if you needed a ride home." "Of course, I want a ride home," she said, frowning. "Why wouldn't I?" As she spoke, Jim reached out to slap me on the back. "Great seeing you again, buddy," he said, extending his hand. I gripped it hard, fueled by anger and adrenaline. By the time he realized what was happening, my grip had tightened to the point of pain. His knees buckled slightly, and his smarmy grin turned into a silent grimace. "JT, you're hurting him," Emily cried. I released him abruptly. "Oh, sorry. My bad," I said, then turned and walked to the car without looking back to see if she was following. By the time I got to the car and buckled up, Emily had caught up with me. "What was that about?" she demanded as she climbed in. I stayed silent, my jaw tight. The drive back to her apartment was tense, the air between us heavy with unspoken accusations. When we arrived, she looked at me with wide, imploring eyes. "Honey, come on up." Nothing happened with Jim. We were just having fun. "Well, I've had about enough fun for one night. See you later," I said, and drove off, ignoring her calls as I left. The next week was a blur of work and self-reflection. I decided to leave for the coast a day early, throwing myself into my practice and enjoying the quiet solace of my hometown. Emily kept texting and calling, her messages growing increasingly apologetic. I kept my replies brief, still unsure of how to move forward. When I returned home the following Friday, the doorbell rang almost as soon as I walked in. Emily stood there in a raincoat, holding a wrapped present. "This is for you," she said softly, handing it to me. Inside was a vintage skeleton key. "You hold the key to my heart," she said, her voice trembling. "I sterte her, conflicted." Then she unbelted the raincoat, revealing a figure that would stop traffic. Whatever resolve I had melted away in an instant. Later, as we lay tangled together, I asked her what had happened with Jim that night. "I know I shouldn't have gone outside with him," she admitted. "But he was so nice, and I didn't want to be rude." "What happened?" I pressed, my voice low. "Nothing," she said quickly. "He tried to get a little—" She hesitated. Emily turned to me with a soft, almost playful smile. "Jim got a little handsy," she admitted, "but I've been handling guys like that since I was 14. Nothing happened." I sighed, conflicted but relieved to hear her explanation. "Emily," I began, carefully choosing my words, "I'll admit, I get jealous. I can't help it. If you're not ready for a serious relationship, I'd understand, but I need to know where we stand. I don't play around. I'm either in a casual relationship or fully committed. And what we have, this isn't casual to me." She rolled on top of me, her face inches from mine. "I'm committed, JT," she whispered. "I love you, and I want to be with you forever." She kissed me deeply, and what followed left no doubt about her feelings. Despite my lingering concerns, life returned to normal after the truth or dare party. Emily didn't hold grudges, and her love and affection seemed to shine even brighter. She was attentive and warm, and I noticed her pulling back a bit from Sally when I was around. One Saturday afternoon, while I was working in the yard, Trent strolled by. It wasn't unusual. He lived nearby, and he'd often stop to chat. This time, we struck up a conversation about lawns and gardening, which eventually moved to the back deck over drinks. I wasn't particularly close to Trent. His cocky demeanor didn't sit well with me. But as the conversation flowed, he opened up about his custody battle, revealing a vulnerable side that made him more relatable. I started to rethink my opinion of him. Out of the blue, Trent asked, "Where's Emily?" "She's out shopping," I replied. We resumed our chat until, about 15 minutes later, Emily appeared. She was wearing a tiny bikini and slipped behind the privacy screen, calling out a cheerful greeting to Trent as she passed. Trent couldn't resist trying to sneak a peek, his eyes following her. I quickly wrapped up the conversation and walked him to the gate. As he left, he joked, "Think she needs any help with sunscreen?" The comment struck a nerve, reminding me of the situation with Jim Callister. But I let it go, focusing instead on how much our relationship had improved since those earlier days. I'd forgiven Emily's behavior at the time, reasoning that we hadn't been fully committed then. Now we were. She was affectionate, fun, and adventurous in ways that made me feel alive. Emily began hinting about our future, and I'd been thinking about it too. I was torn. Part of me worried about whether she was truly the right long-term match for me. But another part couldn't imagine life without her. She was every man's dream, and I knew no one else could compare. Eventually, I made my decision. I proposed to her in the most unforgettable way I could think of, surprising her with a Caribbean vacation. She was thrilled, calling her mom and Sally to share the news. My parents were happy for me, though my dad's tone suggested some hesitation. The resort was breathtaking with pools, bars, and a private beach that felt like paradise. On our first day, Emily wore a revealing bikini that turned heads wherever we went. We sipped drinks, strolled along the shore, and ended the day watching the sunset from our balcony. The night quickly turned physical, and it was as if we were living in a dream. The staff at the resort were incredibly attentive, always ready to bring towels, drinks, or anything else we needed. Among them was Cruz, a young beach attendant with golden skin, a lean build, and a magnetic smile. He seemed particularly attentive to Emily, who caught his eye more than once with her skimpy bikinis. One afternoon, I suggested we go jet skiing, but Emily wanted to work on her tan. I arranged a session on my own, speeding across the ocean and feeling the adrenaline wash away my worries. When I returned, however, my mood shifted. There was Cruz, massaging Emily's bare back. Her bikini top was undone, and his hands lingered in a way that made my blood boil. "What's going on here?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Cruz jumped to his feet, stammering, "I didn't want Miss Emily to get sunburned, so I was just applying sunscreen." "I'll handle it." "Thanks," I said firmly, and Cruz hurried off. I turned to Emily. "What was that about?" I asked quietly, but firmly. She shrugged. "What do you mean? Your top is undone, and that guy had free access to your body. Was he feeling you up?" She rolled her eyes. "Relax, JT. He might have touched the sides a little, but my body is only for you." I swallowed my frustration, choosing to let it go for the sake of the trip. Soon after, I suggested a siesta, and Emily knew exactly what I meant. As we walked back to our room, I carried a towel to hide my arousal. The vacation ended on a high note, with us discussing wedding plans on the flight home. But as Emily dozed beside me, my thoughts drifted back to Cruz and the way his hands had lingered on her. Back home, life returned to its usual rhythm. Work kept me busy, and Emily continued her shifts at Lucas, though mostly during lunch hours so we could spend evenings together. She didn't need the money, but enjoyed having her own independence. As summer approached, Emily and Sally began planning the next couples gathering. After the Truth or Dare fiasco, I'd hoped these parties would fade away, but they settled on hosting the next one at Trent and Lisa's place in mid-July. The next gathering was set for mid-July, a pool party at Trent and Lisa's. When Emily told me, my first reaction was firm. No bikinis from the Caribbean. She smiled innocently. "What about the red one?" "No way," I replied, shaking my head. "Strangers seeing you in something like that is one thing, but not our friends." To my surprise, she didn't argue, and I thought the issue was settled. But life is a way of throwing curveballs. Just days before the party, my mom called with alarming news. My dad had suffered a heart attack and needed bypass surgery. Emily and I rushed to the hospital, her hand in mine as I drove, trying to keep me calm. Thankfully, the surgery was a success, and the doctors assured us my dad would make a full recovery. I stayed by his side that night while Emily and my mom went home to rest. The next day, Dad was in good spirits, even working on a crossword puzzle. Emily, however, seemed restless. By the afternoon, I suggested she head back home. "You've been amazing, but I know you're bored out of your mind here," I said gently. She hesitated but eventually agreed. Over the next couple of days, I stayed busy helping my parents settle back into a routine. By Friday, when I called Emily, she sounded excited. "Are you coming home tomorrow?" she asked eagerly. "Not until Sunday at the earliest," I replied. She hesitated. "Well, Sally and Lisa have been pestering me about the pool party. Should I go?" "If you wanna," I said, though something about it made me uneasy. Saturday passed uneventfully as I helped my mom organize the basement. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I realized I hadn't called Emily. I quickly dialed her number, and she picked up on the third ring. "Hi, honey," she answered, her voice cheerful. There was loud music and laughter in the background. "Where are you?" I asked, though I already knew. "At Trent and Lisa's." "We're having a great time," she replied, sounding distracted. "Emily, how much have you had to drink?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. The connection crackled. "What? You're breaking up," she said, laughing. "Can I call you back?" I'll call you back, I said, frustrated, but before I could hang up, the line stayed open. That's when I heard it. Trent's voice, loud and clear. Get that top off too. This was followed by laughter, and what I thought was Emily's voice giggling in response. Then the line went dead. My heart pounded. What the hell is going on? I muttered. Too exhausted to drive but desperate for answers, I decided to call Henry Anderson, an old neighbor who lived nearby. Henry, I need a favor, I said. Can you swing by Trent and Lisa's and take some pictures of what's going on in their backyard? I need to know. Henry didn't ask questions. On it, he replied. Relieved, I finished my work, turned off my phone, and collapsed in a bed, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke to find several photos from Henry waiting on my phone. As I scrolled through them, my stomach churned. Photo 1. Emily completely unclothed with Trent. Photo 2. Carl, also unclothed, grabbing Emily. Photo 3. Emily and Sally, both unclothed, dancing for Trent and Carl. Photo 4. Trent having sex with Emily. I stared at the images, numb. There was no denying what I was seeing. This wasn't harmless fun or innocent flirting. This was betrayal. Irrefutable proof of Emily's infidelity. Around noon, Emily called, her voice as affectionate as ever. I miss you. How's your dad? When are you coming home? I really need you, she said. I nearly confronted her then, but I stopped myself. Dad's taken a turn for the worse. I lied. I need to stay another week. Oh no, she said, sounding genuinely concerned. Do you need me to come up? No, I replied quickly. It's best if you don't. Dad can't handle the excitement. She accepted my excuse without question, and I hung up, already forming a plan. That Monday, I returned to the city and called my old roommate, Julian, to see if I could crash at his place for a few days. Of course, JT, he said, surprised but accommodating. When I arrived, I confided everything to him, even showing him the photos. Julian was stunned. I knew Emily was flirty, but this? I never imagined she'd cheat, he said. I need to get even. With her, with Trent, with all of them. I admitted, my voice cold. But she can't know I'm onto her yet. Julian nodded. You've got my support, whatever you decide. The next day, I tracked down Carl outside his building. Spotting him heading for his truck, I waved him over. Carl, let's grab a beer, I suggested. He looked surprised but agreed. We found a quiet tavern, and after a couple of drinks, I leaned in. So, what happened Saturday night? Carl shrugged nonchalantly. Just another typical party, he said, sipping his beer. Typical? I asked, sliding one of Henry's photos across the table. Carl's face paled. Hey man, the girls got a little wild. It didn't mean anything, he stammered. No big deal. I repeated, my voice dangerously low. I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a dangerous tone. But what do you think your boss would say about this? Carl froze, his eyes widening. His boss was deeply religious, and Carl was desperate for that promotion. He stood abruptly, but I shoved him back into his seat. Sit down and shut up, I ordered. I have questions, and unless you want these photos sent to your boss, you're going to answer them. Carl looked trapped, his face pale. Okay, he muttered. For the next hour, Carl spilled everything. He started with Emily's high school years, painting a picture I wasn't prepared for. Emily and Sally were part of the poorer group back then, he explained, his tone bitter. The wealthier kids teased them for their outdated clothes and beat-up cars. But they knew their looks gave them an edge. Emily was gorgeous, and Sally had, well, certain assets. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay silent as Carl continued. By 15, they both had boyfriends, probably lost their purity around then, he said nonchalantly, taking a sip of his beer. My stomach churned, but I let him talk. Later in high school, after a string of short relationships, Sally told me about a conversation she had with Emily. Emily said, all I want are nice clothes, a nice car, and a nice house. I like sex, so I don't mind trading it for material things. I'll find a man who can give me that. The wealthier, the better. My blood ran cold. So, she's always been like this? I asked, struggling to keep my voice even. Carl nodded. Pretty much. When you two started dating, she already had a boyfriend. She told Sally she thought you had better prospects, so she dated you while still seeing the other guy for about 3 months. Anger surged through me. She was with both of us at the same time? Yeah, Carl admitted almost casually. And since you've been married, well, I know of at least 2 other guys she's been with. I almost choked on my drink. Who? I demanded. I don't know all the details, Carl said, shrugging. One was a guy named Mallister or something. She said you knew him. My mind immediately flashed to Jim Callister, the smug guy from the party before we got married. My jaw tightened as I processed this bombshell. So, if someone wealthier with a nicer car and house came along, she'd leave me? I asked, already knowing the answer. Carl didn't hesitate. Yes, she would. I sat in stunned silence, the weight of everything crushing me. Finally, I asked, what about Saturday? Was Lisa involved? Carl shook his head. No, Lisa left early. Her sister's boyfriend got into a fight, so she bailed. That's when things really kicked off. So Lisa doesn't know what happened? I pressed, feeling a faint sense of relief. No, and don't tell her, Carl said firmly. I nodded, then asked, does it bother you that Sally's with other guys? Carl snorted. Wife? We're not married. Sally calls me her husband, but we've never tied the knot. I care about her. But marriage? Not a chance. That's why we don't have kids. It was time to go. I had more than enough to think about. Emily wasn't just promiscuous. She was with me for financial security and would leave the moment a better option appeared. Carl might have seemed clueless, but even he was smarter than me when it came to women. Back at Julian's place, I told him everything Carl had shared. Sadness quickly turned to anger, and I felt humiliated. How many people have been laughing at me behind my back? I muttered bitterly. Julian listened quietly, then plugged into his headphones, working on his laptop. I sat there, sipping wine, growing angrier by the minute. Finally, Julian unplugged. Has she ever met John Paul? He asked. No, irapia, kumfusha. I haven't seen him since college. Why? Julian just smiled slyly. A few minutes later, he looked up again. Can you get $30,000 quickly? Yes, but why? I asked, intrigued. And you'll need to lease a BMW for 6 months, he added, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Why? I repeated, more curious than cautious. Julian leaned back, grinning. I have a plan. It'll cost you $30,000 in a car lease, but trust me, it'll be worth it. I listened as Julian laid out his scheme. The idea was audacious. John Paul, a charming and magnetic friend from college, would pose as a wealthy New York investment banker. His job? Seduce Emily, expose her infidelity, and make her believe she was leaving me for something better. John Paul has 5 months before his next theater production starts, so we'll need to move fast, Julian explained. John Paul, a good-looking guy with an irresistible smile, looked at me seriously. Are you okay if I sleep with her? I mean, she's your wife. I stared at him, feeling strangely detached. I don't care. Do what you have to do. With that, we started planning. I provided Emily's work schedule and emphasized the need for secrecy. When I returned home to Emily, I did my best to act normal, blaming any odd behavior on stress over my dad. Either I was a better actor than I thought, or she wasn't paying attention. By Thursday night, we reconvened at Julian's condo. I was eager for an update, torn between wanting Emily to fall for John Paul and hoping she wouldn't. John Paul began confidently. I've been to Lucas 3 times. The first time, I made sure she noticed me. The second, we had some light conversation. John Paul began at our Thursday meeting, his grins signaling progress. Third time, we exchanged names. She told me she works 11 to 3. Tomorrow, I'll show up at 2 for a late lunch and coffee with her. I had to buy a $1,200 suit to play the part. I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and dread. The next week passed uneventfully, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening between Emily and John Paul. It was like waiting for the next episode of a gripping drama. I was eager to hear what would happen next. On Thursday night, John Paul delivered his latest update. We had coffee on Friday, he began, clearly pleased with himself. Emily mentioned she's married but hinted at problems, making herself seem available. We set a lunch date for Tuesday. He went on to explain how he'd subtly hinted at his wealth, revealing just enough to intrigue her. Meanwhile, I started noticing Emily becoming cooler toward me, which, ironically, was a good sign. On the day of their lunch date, I got home after 5, but Emily wasn't there. I went for a run, and when I came back, she still hadn't arrived. As I prepared dinner, she finally walked in. Hey, how was your day? I asked, trying to gauge her reaction. Oh, I ended up working late, she replied, her tone too casual to be convincing. I knew she hadn't worked late, but I played along, letting the distance between us grow. The sex was still good, but it felt purely physical, mechanical. It made it easier to fake my emotions, and I let her believe everything was fine. Dad needs some help, I told her one evening. I have to leave Friday afternoon. Should I come with you? She asked, though her tone was half-hearted. No, it's fine, I replied. I'm just helping out and staying through next week to meet clients. That Thursday night, John Paul reported back with another grin. The lunch date turned into a kissing session, he revealed. She mentioned you'd be out of town, so we made plans for Friday night. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger, betrayal, and satisfaction. The plan was working perfectly. Still, a small part of me couldn't believe this was happening. As the weeks passed, Emily and John Paul's relationship progressed as expected. By the weekend, I was certain they'd slept together. I stayed conveniently out of the way, spending time at my parents' house while she was with him. At home, Emily began pulling away from me emotionally. It was bittersweet, but it was what I needed to execute the plan. Occasionally, I'd catch glimpses of the woman I once loved, which made it all the harder. After about 3 months, John Paul told me he'd begun expressing his love to Emily, asking her for a commitment. By then, she was fully convinced he was a wealthy New York investment banker with a swanky Manhattan apartment. When she talks about you, it's clear she's moved on, John Paul said during one of our meetings. She told me the relationship is over, but hasn't had the guts to have that conversation with you yet. Not long after, Emily approached me casually. Sally and I are planning a spa weekend in California. Is that okay? I knew the real reason. John Paul had invited her to Sun Valley for the weekend. Sure, have fun, I said, pretending to be clueless. That night, she was unusually affectionate, almost as if she was trying to soothe her guilt. I couldn't help but think about how clueless she was about the trap she'd walked into. John Paul planned to propose during the trip, using a $500 cubic zirconia ring that looked convincingly real. Emily would never suspect it wasn't the real deal. At our Thursday meeting, John Paul showed me a photo of Emily beaming, proudly displaying the ring. She said yes, he said, unable to hide his amusement. She told me she'll talk to you about leaving this week. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The plan was simple. I'd act devastated, fight her on it, and drag out the separation just long enough to make her desperate for a quick exit. That way, she'd agree to my terms, ensuring my assets were protected. When Emily finally approached me, her voice was shaky. JT, we need to talk, she said hesitantly. I looked up, feigning confusion. What's wrong? She took a deep breath. I think it's time for us to separate. I've met someone else, and I want to be with him. I acted shocked, my voice trembling. What? We're married, Emily. I can't believe this. She avoided my gaze, clearly uncomfortable. I'm sorry, JT, but it's over. I need to move on. Switching to anger, I shouted. I won't let you leave. We need counseling to work this out. Emily was surprised by my reaction, but I could see she was eager to end things quickly, just as I'd planned. A few days later, she came home with a document and placed it on the table between us. This is what I'm suggesting, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I'll give up. Emily placed the documents on the table between us, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm giving up any claim to your assets. Our house, your vehicle, everything. All I ask for is an immediate divorce. I stared at the papers, pretending to be utterly shattered. I can't believe you're doing this, I whispered, my voice trembling as I summoned fake tears with a few drops of Visine. She watched me, her expression a mix of guilt and determination. It's what's best for both of us, she said softly. With a trembling hand, I signed the papers, making sure to maintain the act until the very end. As she picked up the documents and left, I noticed a spring in her step. She thought she was walking into a new life with a wealthy man in New York, but in reality, she was walking straight into the final stage of my plan. It was mid-September, and our divorce would be finalized by October 5th. Emily had relinquished any interest in my assets and believed she'd be moving to New York to marry John Paul by the end of the month. That Thursday, we met at Julian's condo to finalize the plan. John Paul would stay at the rented luxury condo for the next 2 weeks, continuing the charade. On the Friday, Emily was supposed to leave for New York. She'd return to our house to pack her belongings. John Paul would tell her he'd meet her there with a moving truck, but of course, he'd never show up. By the time she realizes what's happening, John Paul will be gone, Julian said with a smirk. Along with her dreams of a new life, I added coldly. John Paul told her his last name was Taylor. Julian continued, his grin widening. She'll have a hard time finding him, and if she tries, it'll cost her. Or she'll just give up, broke and humiliated. John Paul nodded, though there was a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. This is pretty harsh, man, he said, turning to me. Are you sure about this? I met his gaze without hesitation. Not nearly as harsh as what she did to me, I replied. John Paul sighed. I get it, but damn, she was something else. I'll miss that piece of meat. She was as good as it gets. I exhaled slowly, my emotions a tangled mix of anger, sadness, and relief. Yeah, I'll miss it too, I admitted. But it's time to move on. In the weeks leading up to her departure, my interactions with Emily were polite but distant. I had to fake remorse a few times, but I never asked her to reconsider staying with me. Truthfully, I was afraid she might say yes. On the Friday she was supposed to leave, I met her at the house as she packed her belongings. She was dressed to impress, clearly believing she was about to begin a new, glamorous chapter of her life. Do you need any help with the packing? I offered, keeping my tone neutral. No, I'm fine, she said with a bright smile, eager to be done with this part of her life. By 12:30 p.m., she made her first call to John Paul. I watched her expression shift from confusion to frustration as the call didn't go through. The number's been disconnected, she muttered, redialing. She turned to me, her face pale. Can I use your phone? Sure, I said, handing it to her and watching as she tried again. The result was the same. Her panic grew as she called the luxury condo where John Paul had been staying, only to be told that the lease had ended and the unit was now available for rent. I'm going to drive back to the condo and see what's going on, she said, her voice trembling. Can I leave my stuff here for now? Of course, I replied calmly. Take your time. She left in a hurry, and I didn't hear from her for the rest of the weekend. I knew exactly what she was experiencing. Confusion, panic, and eventually, the crushing realization that she'd been played. While Emily was unraveling, I set the next phase of my plan into motion. I prepared 3 packets containing photos from the infamous sex party she'd participated in while I was at the hospital with my dad. Each packet included images of Trent, Sally, Carl, and Emily, faces and bodies fully exposed. Packet 1 was sent to Carl's deeply religious boss, accompanied by a note that read, I believe a man's moral character is reflected in the quality of the work they do. Don't you? Packet 2 went to Trent's ex-wife with a message. Look at what your ex is up to. Thank goodness the children are with you. Packet 3 went to Lisa, along with a note that said, I guess you and I missed the best part of the party. Sorry to bring you this news, but you deserve to know. Once things calm down, would you like to get a drink? I signed the notes with my name and phone number. There was one more loose end, Jim Callister. The smug grin from that party years ago still haunted me. I briefly considered asking Julian to come up with something for him, but I decided he wasn't worth the effort. My focus remained on finishing what I'd started with Emily. She showed up unannounced the following Monday evening, acting as if nothing had happened. Hi, honey, she said with a forced smile, dropping her bag by the door. Sorry about our little misunderstanding. I'm home for good. I stared at her, my expression ice cold. Home, I said, my voice dripping with contempt. Emily, you destroyed my life. This is not your home. You were planning to run off to New York with someone else, remember? Her face paled, but she quickly tried to recover. No, I've changed my mind, she insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. It's you I want. I was done playing nice. Forget it, I said bluntly. Get the hell out of here and don't come back. Her eyes flashed with panic, and she resorted to the oldest trick in her book. She stripped off her top, letting it fall to the floor, and unhooked her bra, standing there bare-chested. You don't mean that, she cooed, her voice low and seductive. We can fix this. Let me show you how much I want you. I didn't flinch. Say hi to John Paul for me, I said, slamming the door in her face. I glanced out the window and saw her standing there, frozen. Her expression was blank, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was starting to realize just how deeply she'd been deceived. All those whispered promises, the fake engagement, the illusion of a wealthy life in New York, it all unraveled in an instant. As I turned away, I noticed Henry Anderson leaning over the fence, his eyes wide as he got an eyeful of Emily standing there, half naked. I chuckled to myself. The saga of Emily was finally over. The fallout from the photos was swift and devastating. Last I heard, Emily had moved in with Sally. No doubt she was already on the hunt for her next better option. Carl didn't just lose his promotion, he lost his job. His boss, horrified by the photos, fired him outright. Carl left town shortly after, abandoning Sally without a word. Trent's life didn't fare much better. When he went to court for his custody hearing, the photos became damning evidence against him. The judge not only denied him custody, but also restricted his visitation rights even further. One Saturday night, I got a frantic call from Jackie. "Trent's coming to your house," she said, her voice trembling. "He's drunk, and he has a weapon. He knows you sent those photos." My heart pounded, but I kept calm. "Thanks for the warning," I said, already forming a plan. I grabbed some blankets and pillows, arranging them on the chaise lounge in my backyard to look like a person, leaving a small light on for effect. I then hid in the thick bushes behind the privacy screen, armed with a baseball bat. Even if Jackie hadn't called, I would have heard Trent coming. His heavy footsteps and slurred curses echoed through the night. He pounded on the front door, shouting my name. When I didn't answer, he stumbled through the gate into the backyard. Spotting the figure on the lounge chair, he raised his gun and fired twice into the blankets. The first swing of the bat broke his arm, and he dropped the weapon with a howl of pain. The second swing? I aimed lower, ensuring Trent wouldn't be a threat to anyone in that way again. He collapsed, groaning in agony, as I grabbed his gun and called the police. When the officers arrived, the scene was clear-cut. A drunk man with a weapon and shots fired? There wasn't much investigation needed. I was defending myself, and Trent was arrested on attempted murder charges. Later that night, I called Jackie to thank her for the warning. "You're welcome," she said, her voice still shaky. Then she hesitated. "Now, about that drink you mentioned?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "How about next Saturday?" "Sounds good," she replied, her tone softening. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of peace. The chaos of the past year had finally settled, leaving me with a clean slate. Emily, Trent, Carl, and Sally were all ghosts of my past now. For the first time in a long while, I looked forward to the future, not with bitterness, but with hope. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.